we're often told that things that are good, like attempting to address a problem on your borders, for example, like legitimate terrorism, which unfortunately people all across the Central Asia, West Asia, and into East Asia, including in China for many, many years, they have to deal with, and mainly because of U.S. foreign policy. So when a country like China actually addresses that and helps people get jobs, helps elevate their standard of living, then we're told, oh no, they're throwing in concentration camps. So we're often told that things that are actually to the benefit of the collective around the world is actually to their detriment. For example, the conflict in Ukraine is a big one here. We're told that the people of the Donbass republics are being invaded and occupied by Russia, when in fact they were asking Russia to come help them right after the coup, or we should say really during what transpired during that coup in 2014, the US-backed coup. They asked Donetsk, Lugansk, they asked earlier. They wanted an intervention. It probably would have been smaller in scale at that point, but Russia said no because they trusted the Minsk Accords and the whole story there, backstabbed. So we're told that something that was actually a collective process is to the detriment of the people involved. And we're told then that the United States, sitting on its high horse, is correct to then foment and pursue a proxy war there so that the United States can benefit, because it's all about the United States. So we're often told all global developments are seen through this lens. I've talked a lot about American exceptionalism, and really what it is, it's Western exceptionalism, because American exceptionalism is an outgrowth of this Western, quote unquote, civilizational model of imperialism.
So as a journalist and commentator in independent media, what drove you to be a journalist? And can you give us a brief summary on how you got into this?
Well, it's actually quite simple. When I was in college, that was when I became politically active, mainly as an activist. And as you may know, JB, and I think it's more of a conversation now, college campuses and the politics of academia really push a particular narrative about things. So when I was starting to become more aware of, for example, race relations, racism in the United States, I was mainly digesting kind of academic frameworks for how to understand that. And that inevitably led me to a lot of frustrations, because a lot of the way that academia, shocker here, looks at something like racism is it completely divorces class from the equation, and even history, so to speak, depending on how you are learning about this in college. You can learn a lot about privilege and these kind of things, but it is often divorced from context, from history, from class, from understanding social relations of power. And so that was incredibly frustrating, because I ended up finding out that many people who become politically active on college campuses are still really thinking about how they can advance their careers. And that leads to a lot of conflicts of interest, a lot of, how should I say, hesitancy to confront power structures. And so that led me to wanting to understand more about how this world worked. And it led me to a lot of different arenas. Actually, we're going to talk about Palestine today. And, when I was in college, I was looking and trying to find out where I could plug myself into. And most college campuses have an issue with Zionism, and so did mine. And that led me to find Arab students who were very frustrated, is probably an understatement. And that led me to learning more about this. I actually brought Norman Finkelstein to my campus. I went to a college called Skidmore College, and I actually brought him. I helped them out just trying to get money, because I was working in the so-called diversity office at the time, and I was able to help them get some money because, you know, you got to pay someone like Finkelstein to come speak, even
Yeah.
if it isn't much, because there was a lot of pushback to that. So with all that said, I really got my beginnings in journalism basically as a frustrated activist, because the more I got involved, I interned at a
Mhm.
labor union in New York City during Occupy Wall
Yeah.
Street, and I saw all these
Mhm.
contradictions. You had a lot of like middle class kids trying to figure it out, screaming about the 1% against the 99%, not really relating to the working class as much. And then you had unions not really relating to something like Occupy as much. And so
Yeah.
I was really looking for how can I put all of this together. And so then I started studying
Yeah.
more, reading more. I got plugged into Black Agenda Report.
Mhm.
And then when I graduated from college for many years, I just submitted to them. And Glenn Ford, the late Glenn Ford, rest in power to him, he published my work, and we built a relationship over many, many, many years. And then during COVID, I needed to make some decisions for my family. I also was going in a different direction with my work. I was starting to think more internationally, feeling like that was more appropriate for my role in this struggle,
Mm.
especially given that there's a lot of contradictions when you write for a publication like Black Agenda Report and mainly talk about race relations and racism and class and all those things in the United States. So I
Yeah.
was looking at where can I really be of service, and I found that there was a lot to discuss and to educate people around. And, you know, the anti-war movement is at a really low point in the United States. And so I
Oh, yeah.
felt like if I can harness and focus on geopolitics, especially in this time when the US is waging a Cold War 2.0 on China, that would be a more appropriate place for me. And then I went to China and I saw all of the development and all of what was going on in China. I got to see for myself with my own eyes the discrepancy between what the US says about China and how China actually is. And that
Mhm.
then motivated me to really focus on this Cold War 2.0 against China
Mhm.
and also against Russia. So it's been
Mhm.
a long journey. And I would say that geopolitics really, for me, became important when I started to learn about the NATO invasion of Libya, then the proxy war in Syria,
Yeah.
and relating those wars to wars before, and then seeing how those wars led us to this moment where the United
Yeah.
States is
It's a
engaged in a Cold
progression.
War against
Yeah.
Russia and China, and how all of those things are interlocked. So that is kind of where I went. And then I started my YouTube channel and began to really harness and focus on this area the more that I did it, because I just felt like there was a real gap, especially from a leftist perspective, because to be honest, a lot of the geopolitics community is not on the left. And so it's a challenge to talk to people who are focusing on these things from a leftist perspective without people saying, oh, well, you're this and that, you know, without their McCarthyist kind of baggage coming up, without maybe some anti-communist baggage coming up. So that's been kind of the challenge for me, is how do I move people who are already looking at these questions to a more active direction, to a direction that is more about peace than rather than like choosing teams or something like that, which, you know, I'm not going to lie, I do choose sides all the time, because I feel like it's a duty of anyone who is looking at major conflicts, major struggles around the world, domestically, internationally. It is your duty to take a side, but you got to do that with information, with understanding, with consciousness, and with the principles that I think all too often get lost when we are simply trying to just debunk, debunk, debunk. Well, no, we have to also have principles behind what we're doing. It is about stopping war, but it's also about being for things. And so I try to bring that to my work on geopolitics, global developments, is we have to also be for something positive, not positive like good, but positive like something is happening in the world and
Mhm.
it means that it could benefit the vast majority of people. So we should then therefore support that. So that's kind of where I'm at in my work. And that's how I got started, was first
Mhm.
a lot of writing, a lot of writing about race, about class, about war, about
Yeah.
how all those things are interconnected, and informing that with my own background as a working class person, and as someone who I just went to Vietnam. I'm just starting to get connected to that side of myself, and understanding how I related to this system over time, and informing then my analysis of world developments with my experiences, and also with, of course, the knowledge, information, background, context, all of that. So I try to bring that to people from a perspective that they don't often get to hear, because we live in a system, we live in a time in history, especially in the US and the collective West as a whole. We live in a time where the information is so saturated with misinformation. We don't have real good sources of information at this time, and we're often told that if it comes from China, Russia, Iran, anywhere else in the world where the US is trying to pursue war, then it's somehow all lies, when in reality, what we read and watch all across the corporate Western mainstream media is essentially either lies or extreme distortions meant to uh, push us into a path of war.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so very much for that. One of the things I noticed though is that when you were explaining about your time in college, it seems like college has become almost this vessel for just individualism. And so you are a person of a very collective mindset. And so you said this just, it's like I'm learning what I need to learn, but at the same time, it's pushing me into a direction that seems very selfish. When in reality, I want to go into a more collective type of world. And so that also translates into your coverage, your writing, and even the way you outlook as far as the way things should be geopolitically. Am I, correct in that?
Uh, yes, definitely. I mean, it's funny because a lot of the work I do now is solo. I mean, I get some help from people who are generous enough to volunteer time,
Hmm.
and I thank them so much for that. But in terms of a lot of my work ends up being solo now, because I mean, it takes a lot of time to do. As you probably know now, JB, it takes a lot of time to do this work on YouTube. There's a lot of administrative, let's say,
Yeah.
awful things that we have to do. Like, for example, I hate coming up with titles. It just drives me nuts. Like, I
Oh
hate
my
it.
God.
It's the
Yes, I hate
worst.
it.
And they often end up being extremely simple and probably clickbaity, because my mind is just like gone. Like, I just can't do it. But anyway,
Yeah.
um, with that said, in terms of the work, indefinitely, that's my mindset, is we need to look at global developments not from the perspective, or any political development, but especially world developments, not from the perspective of, oh, how is it going to benefit me, but how is it going to benefit me and all of us? Because I think that's what often gets we often are told that everything good in the world is actually a contradiction, is actually antagonism for us. So we're taught that if China alleviates poverty, then that's a lie. They're actually doing the opposite. They're throwing Uyghurs in concentration camps, for example, right? Like,
Dude, don't get me
we're often
started. This is
told that
hilarious.
things that are good, like uh, 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 attempting to address a problem on your borders, for example, like legitimate terrorism, which unfortunately people all across the Central Asia, West Asia, and into East Asia, including in China for many, many years,
Yeah.
they have to deal with, and mainly because of US foreign policy. So when a country like China actually addresses that, and get helps people get jobs, helps elevate their standard of living, then we're told, oh no, they're throwing in concentration camps. So we're often told that things that are actually to the benefit of the collective around the world is actually to their detriment. For example, the conflict in Ukraine is a big one here. We're told that the people of the Donbass republics are being invaded and occupied by Russia, when in fact they were asking Russia to come help them right after the coup, or we should say, really, during what transpired during that coup in 2014, the US-backed coup. They asked Donetsk, Lugansk. They all asked. They asked earlier. They wanted an intervention. It probably would have been smaller in scale at that point, but Russia said no because they trusted the Minsk Accords and the whole story there,
Yeah.
backstabbed. So we're told that something that was actually a collective process is to the detriment of the people involved. And we're told then that the United States, sitting on its high horse, is correct to then foment and pursue a proxy war there so that the United States can benefit, because it's all about the United States. So we're often told all global developments are seen through this lens. I've talked a lot about American exceptionalism, and really what it is, it's Western exceptionalism, because American exceptionalism is an outgrowth of this Western quote unquote civilizational model of imperialism. But the ideology that says that, well, if you live in this part of the world, then your governments, your societies have the right to trample on everybody else. That is also an extension of individualism, ironically done collectively in many ways. Like, we are often told that we need to collectively support things that are really supposed to just benefit a tiny few people. And that, of course, is true economically. That's true politically in our elections, which I know you and the RBN folks talk a lot about in terms of how people like Joe Biden or anyone else in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party talk about politics. It isn't about a collective process. And even when it is, oh, get out and vote for us, it's to benefit just a tiny few. So individualism is very helpful here. And I try to reject it as much as possible, although it's impossible to reject it altogether if you just live and breathe the air in the United States. But I try to reject it as much as possible in my work and promote the multipolar world, which really is a rejection of what is called unipolarity, which is just a nice, very intellectualized term for US hegemony and US dominance around the world. So I try to promote a vision for the world that is not from my head. It's from what other nations, other peoples, and many astute thinkers and activists, et cetera, in the United States and the collective West as well, are also trying to promote this idea that we can live in peace, we can develop together in a stage of economic development where there are many different social systems. Those systems can coexist, but they can't really coexist with empire. So that's the kind of world we live in right now. Is we live in a time where empire is not allowing the coexistence of a multipolar world, because it sees a multipolar world, it sees any kind of collective process, any kind of multilateral mechanism, BRICS, Belt and Road Initiative, we can go on and on. All these multilateral mechanisms are threats to U.S. hegemony, and they must be eradicated, however slowly or however quickly they can be. And that's, and that's kind of the contradiction I try to highlight a lot, because I think it does relate to everything. Like, we can really then understand more social relations at all levels if we can understand it from that level. And it's something that I don't think we get to talk about a lot, especially in our day-to-day, where life is becoming harder and harder and harder in the United States and Europe and the West, in the English speaking world, we could say. So yeah, that's kind of true. At least I try. It's not easy to be a one-man show and not be individualistic, but I do try to um, definitely promote the collective vision, the multipolar world, and how we can talk about it and engage in it, and how there are really inspiring things that are happening, around the world, and that can be something we can take inspiration from, especially in this moment where we are getting just trauma, genocide. I mean, we are in a moment where all we are seeing, if we scroll through social media and we care about anything in the world, the first thing that's coming up is Israel's massacre in Gaza. And that, that's important to pay attention to, surely. And it's important to stand with Palestine. And it's also important to understand it within this context of why this is happening. And I think a main reason why this is happening is because Israel, always being the attack dog of the United States, is opportunistically trying to achieve objectives that fall in line with this larger decline of the US empire. And it really is supposed to disrupt not just Palestinian existence and eliminate Palestinian existence potentially, but also disrupt any kind of resistance around the world to U.S. empire, to U.S. hegemony.